Have you ever noticed that every single map you've ever seen of the world is flat out wrong? If you look closely at any one of them, they all follow the same pattern. The continents are stretched out and squished together along the edges like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And nowhere is this more egregious than here in the middle, where the continent of Africa is literally half the size it should be. Here's the whole world mapped in just under 3 minutes. Every map you've ever seen is lying about Africa, and it's not an accident. First, we need to go back to the source. This is the original Mercator Projection map that was published all the way back in 1569. You can tell it as the original because that is the only one where the Americas do already have roads connecting them. And if you look closely, you can see Africa, but it looks nothing like the shriveled up raisin that's replaced it. And if you thought that was bad, hold on, because here's the even crazier part. In case you couldn't tell, that's the whole continent of Africa right there next to it. To prove it, let me put the two images side by side. And now you can see what every map is lying about. They folded Africa to fit their story. But why do they do that? What's the point of hiding something so obvious? Well, it turns out this wasn't just a whim or an oversight. It was a deliberate choice made by the very people who had set out to erase Africa, the Portuguese. See, after decades of sailing around the coast of Africa, they had finally found a way to sail directly across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, and they did it by taking advantage of the Earth's rotation. As they sailed west, the ground beneath their feet kept moving east, and that meant they could essentially catch a ride. Now, here's the thing. The farther north or south you are on Earth's surface, the faster the ground moves, which means the faster you can travel. And that is what enabled the Portuguese to get to the Americas so quickly. But there was a problem. While some sailors realized what was happening, they didn't know exactly what it meant. They were on a curved surface, but they imagined the Earth to be flat. So, to try and understand what was happening, they drew maps. And the best way they could think to represent the curve of the Earth on a flat piece of paper was to stretch and distort everything near the poles. And that brings us back to Africa. Because when you stretch the top and bottom of a map, the only way to keep it all connected is to shrink the middle. And the result is the Mercator Projection, the map we use today. Now, the good news is that this distortion doesn't affect navigation. In fact, the Mercator Projection makes it easier for sailors to plot courses because straight lines on the map correspond to arcs of a circle on the globe, which happen to be the shortest distance between 2 points. But there was another benefit as well, one that the Portuguese weren't aware of at the time. By shrinking Africa, they also shrank its power. Here's what I mean. When you compare the size of Africa to the rest of the world, you might be surprised to learn that it's actually pretty massive. Take the United States, for example. If you laid the two continents side by side, you would see that Africa is more than twice its size. And that's just the United States. If you add in China, India, and Japan, well, Africa is still bigger. And what about Europe? If you added all the countries in the European Union, you would need most of Africa just to match it. In other words, Africa is big enough to fit all those places inside it and still have room to spare. But on a traditional map, you can't really tell. They fold Africa to fit their story. In fact, if you really want to understand just how big Africa is, you need a map that stretches the poles all the way out, like this one. And that means that in order to fit Africa on the same map as the rest of the world, everything else has to be dramatically distorted. But the crazy thing is that this isn't even the real Africa. This is just the part that's above water. And if you want to know how much land Africa actually has, you need to factor in all the deserts below sea level, too. And when you do that, Africa is actually even bigger. But still, even without the desert, Africa is huge. It can fit the US, China, India, and Japan, plus most of Europe inside it with room to spare. So, why have we been lied to our entire lives? Why does the West keep Africa so small? Well, it turns out that this wasn't just a quirk of geography or a coincidence. It was a deliberate choice by the colonial powers, a way of keeping Africa weak. See, once the Portuguese discovered the Americas, they started grabbing land and claiming it for the King of Portugal. But the other European powers didn't take kindly to that. They wanted some of the action too. So they met together in a series of conferences to divide the continent of Africa amongst themselves. Now these guys claim that they were doing it to help bring Christianity to the natives, but let's be honest, they just wanted more land and resources. And to justify that, they needed a reason. And the biggest one they came up with was that Africans were inferior. Not just inferior, actually, they were so far gone that they weren't even human. And to convince themselves of that, they shrunk Africa on maps. That way, it was easier to imagine a continent full of savages. And it gets worse because this wasn't just a random decision. Every aspect of colonial rule was designed to crush the African spirit. They remapped Africa to weaken Africa. I mean, they even changed the names of the locals. Most African countries are named after local tribes, like the Zulu or the Ashanti. But when the Europeans came in, they didn't see a Zulu or an Ashanti. They saw a savage and a barbarian. So they gave them names like Congo, and it wasn't just the names that were lost either. Hundreds of languages were wiped away as the colonizers forced everyone to learn theirs. But if you think about it, this whole thing was based on a lie. And if you fight hard enough, you can reclaim the truth. That's exactly what's happening in South Africa right now. When apartheid ended and democracy arrived, there was a demand for new maps. And the country's cartographers seized the opportunity to set the record straight. They printed new maps of Africa that were actually to scale, maps that showed the continent in its true size. But the best part was that they didn't stop there. They went back further and delved deeper. They uncovered old documents from the colonial era that revealed just how intentional this erasure was. For example, this internal memo from the British Colonial Office discusses nothing less than the design of maps themselves. It talks about how to represent the curve of the Earth on a flat surface, and then makes a casual aside about how it is also handy for hiding Africa. These documents confirmed what everyone already knew, that the erasure of Africa wasn't an accident. It was intentional. And the purpose of this video isn't to condemn anyone in particular. It's to celebrate the courage of those who fought against it. After all, it's only in the last few decades that we've begun to turn things around. There are organizations dedicated to preserving African history and culture, like the African Studies Center at Boston University. Their website has a library of maps that show Africa in its true light. This online exhibit features several different versions of Africa, including the one I've been showing throughout this video. But they also have other maps that show Africa as the birthplace of humanity and others that show the diversity of the people who live there. In other words, they're fighting back against centuries of propaganda. Now, it's important to note that these maps aren't perfect either. For example, this one tries to show the diversity of the indigenous peoples of Africa by coloring the map according to language groups. But that kind of lumps together hundreds of different ethnic groups into just a few categories. Plus, many of the groups that were lumped together speak multiple languages anyway. But that doesn't change the fact that these maps are an improvement. They're helping to rewrite the narrative about Africa, bit by bit, map by map. So remember this feeling the next time someone tries to push you around. Remember, that they once tried to shrink Africa to shrink its power, and that didn't work. Today, we're putting it back where it belongs. This is History Rewritten, and subscribe to see the world differently.